Hello everyone, welcome back to another video here. So, today I have a nice good old dungeons ranked. It is the final ranking for the dungeons. As I get into this video here, of course, I'll be giving my thoughts on the current state of dungeoning, that sort of thing. We're only going to be talking about dungeons in this video in particular. Raids will be a separate video. You'll be seeing a footage of all of the dungeons. However, Vesper's Host and Sunder Doctrine are not going to be included because I do not own those and I am not going to spend money to buy those. So that's something to keep in mind here. However, let me know in the comments below where Sunder Doctrine and Vesper's Host would be for y'all. So, on that note though, in terms of how I feel about the dungeon armor set bonuses and loot refresh, from my perspective of someone that's been raiding and dungeoning for quite some time, eh. I was not interested in any of the dungeon armor sets, armor set bonuses. Yes, I know some of them are good. However, I hate armor set bonuses that are just generally good and not just great for a particular build. That's what I've hated about almost all of the armor set bonuses that Bungie has introduced. Bushido was fine because it benefited from shotguns, swords, and bows, I believe. So that was fine. Some of the other Raider dungeon sets, are a little bit more specific. I prefer armor set bonuses that are specific but great over just general good all-purpose good armor sets, which that's what a lot of the dungeon armor sets are. Or if they're for a particular subclass, they don't really synergize with my playstyle very well. And that goes for all of the dungeon armor set bonuses. So all of them are pretty much on basic playing field. Now, in terms of how I'm considering these dungeon weapons, I'm considering their history along with what they are now. If they were terrible before but are good now, I'm considering them to be, good now. If they were good in the past and good now, I'm considering them in both states and what they meant for the game. That's more relevant when we get to raids, because raids have a little more history to them for the most part, but dungeons are also going to be considered in that respect as well. In terms of the exotics, we'll get into those when we get into the individual ones as well. I do have all of them except for Equilibrium. So when we get to Equilibrium, I will mention those exotics as well. Now you might be asking yourself, how are you doing this? Are you doing this objectively, personal, feely? How are things going? So, for all the dungeons, so for the dungeons, just to make things a little bit more concise, because a lot of these dungeons are very, very close together, and there are very small things that separated them for me personally. Along with, we're going to kind of treat this like an iceberg as well as a ranking. I'll be letting you know what tier I have the dungeon in, and also, well, where I have them, of course. We're, of course, going to be starting from the worst and going up to the best, of course. But my what I believe to be the best dungeon is not my favorite dungeon. I will be, talking about, my favorite dungeon when I get to it. Now, I did give some special notes. I graded these dungeons on difficulty, experience, spectacle, music, loot, and extra stuff. In terms of like if it has a catalyst quest, what is it? Does it have a good looking flawless shader? How does the armor set look visually? That sort of thing. And if it has an exotic ornament tied to it, like does it have it or not? Also, like there are some weird cases here. I will not be going into details on those specifically. Outside of two exceptions, if it is the best dungeon in a particular category, or if it's the hardest dungeon in a category, or if it is the easiest dungeon or is the worst in a particular category. I will be pointing those out and why I believe them to be in that situation. Also, I do have a fun fact for every single dungeon. I tried my best with a lot of these, but with some of the more modern dungeons, these dungeons have not been around a super long period of time, so it's kind of been a little bit rough to find some stuff for some of these dungeons, but I tried to keep it pretty unique. I tried to keep it outside of myself personally. However, the first dungeon, it's not enough unique stuff to it to where I had to go personal there, but I tried to stay away from personal and just, be like actual little fun facts that don't relate to me as a person. So, on that note though, with all said and done, let's go ahead and get into the first ranking here. Now, we have in last place here, in C tier, is Pit of Heresy. So, Pit of Heresy, I do believe, is the worst dungeon in the entire game. The fun fact for you is it has my least amount of clears. Like I said, this one's a little bit basic. I did forget to mention in terms of total dungeon clears, I do have quite a bit. I do have 218 full clears and 276 general clears. So those include like checkpoint clears, that sort of thing. So that's something to keep in mind here as I go through this. But Pit of Heresy has my least amount of clears. Also, my username's out there, so y'all can check, my raid report if y'all want. Just check it. The Pit of Heresy got 2 awards! Woo! That is not a good thing for Pit of Heresy. It has worst experience and worst extras. So, the reason why I have that being the case is for worst experience, it's kind of just rough. It's a decent amount of traps. However, the trap placement is not interesting, like Equilibrium, Grasp of Avarice, or even Warlord's Ruin. There's not interesting trap placement here. Also, actually running the dungeon, the middle part can be confusing at times. None of the encounters, in my personal opinion, are really that fun either. I'm not saying this experience is absolutely awful. Again, we are starting at C tier. Keep in mind, raids will not be starting at C tier. There is going to be a D tier raid. But for C tier, it's all right. It's all right. It's still an all right dungeon. But the experience of the dungeon is just not particularly great. I will say I had to keep some of these experiences in the mind of over the course of time. Currently, you pretty much can't do any dungeons unless you have an Eager Edge Sword. And for raids, the raid experience is pretty bad now. Almost all the great people that were running raids and dungeons for the most part, they have left and did not come back for this event. They did not come back for Destiny 2's final update. So that's something to keep in mind. If you don't have friends, a lot of these activities just feel awful. So I try to keep in mind just a general idea. Even if I personally had a bad experience while recording it, I try to keep an open mind with that and not let it affect that much. The Pit of Heresy has almost never been that fun. So, but yeah, that's why I do believe it is the worst dungeon in terms of experience. However, extra stuff is worse as well. There is no Catalyst quest, which is something that the more modern dungeons have, but it also doesn't have like a cool little wish end egg thing happening with it, like with Shattered Throne. There's just almost nothing in terms of good secret stuff happening with Pit of Heresy, besides the Xenophage quest tie-in. So, and by the way, I did consider Xenophage with the loot as a whole. Now, just going over general things: difficulty mid, spectacle mid, dead middle of the road. Loot is pretty good. By the way, I'm not going to be discussing music unless I actively think the music is bad, or I think the music is actually really, really good. That's the only time I'm going to be mentioning that from here on out. But for the loot in here is not bad. I am considering Xenophage to be with the dungeon, but Xenophage is really good. The Catalyst is really good as well. One of the ones that I kind of wanted, I just didn't get it to drop. I'm also not going to farm for it because I have the 1k Catalyst. We'll get there when we get to raids in a later video. But the loot overall is pretty decent in this dungeon. The armor set bonus is pretty decent as well. So loot was all. But yeah, it got awards for worst experience and worst extras. Okay, and now in our second to worst slot, we have Shattered Throne, which is in B tier. There is a decent gap between, Shattered Throne and Pit of Heresy. Now, Shattered Throne, that one's fun fact for you is it used to be the best spot for Catalyst because there was a thing called the Thrallway that was extremely good for Catalyst. However, Bungie later on disabled all XP gains from Shattered Throne. From the Thrallway. There is a later checkpoint that you can, well, maybe not checkpoint, but there is a later spot that you can get to and still grind Catalyst out because they still count for XP and it infinitely spawns Thrall. However, there are kind of easier spots to get to because you do have to complete the first encounter and defeat a boss in order to get there. And you do have to do quite a bit of parkouring as well in order to get there. Meanwhile, you could do Breakneck for special and heavy ammo weapons, which is in Lightfall, very easy to get to. or you can do Grasp of Avarice, which is literally at the beginning, or you can do Whisperer of the Worms mission that's pretty, and there's a spot that infinitely spawns Thrall that's really easy to get to as well. So there's more spots now, but Thrall Bay used to be where it's at. And you get a double feature because the Shattered Throne is the only dungeon that used to have a different way of accessing than it just being a node. Because what you used to have to do back during Forsaken, and I don't remember when they changed it to just being a node, but you had, I believe, if I remember correctly, the Dreaming City had to be a full power curse, and then a portal would appear in the Dreaming City, like somewhere in the Dreaming City, and then you would have to go through there in order to start the dungeon. So you actually had to locate the dungeon, and it was only around for a limited burst of time. Meanwhile, nowadays, dungeon just releases, you launch it. That's it. So, yeah, that's quite unique. Now, just a reminder, Shattered Throne is in B tier, so it is a full tier above Pit of Heresy. Still pretty decent dungeon. Now, in terms of award, it did get one, being Worst Spectacle. For Spectacle, the kind of the things that are talking about mainly with Spectacle is color palette, set pieces, that sort of thing. You'll kind of understand as we go forward. Now, my issue here with specifically Shattered Throne is it's all black and white. It is all black and white. It is the same exact aesthetic being taken for the entire duration of the dungeon. I hate it. Like, from a visual perspective, it is the worst dungeon in terms of spectacle for me personally by a decent margin. Now, for me personally as well, it is close to being up. Well, actually, no, technically speaking, it is my least favorite spectacle in all of Raider Dungeons. Which, you know, I agree with the me that did this little thing. So, yeah, I really don't like Shattered Throne from a visual perspective. That did drag it down pretty heavily. Difficulty, the dungeon's not that hard. It is a pretty good experience as well. Like, the actually going through the dungeon is pretty good. But it's just the visual stuff is no. And then for the loot in this dungeon is pretty good as well. Wishender, is one of the best exotics in terms of exotic bows. So it's a really, really good exotic bow. So that's something of note. And the armor bonus is pretty good as well. Now the extra stuff. Shattered Throne does have a decent amount of. It has the Wishender eggs. It has the Wishender quest tie-in. I believe that's you also get the Wishender Catalyst from there, if I remember correctly. But it's been a long time. But also, there are secret doors that you can access if you have ring. There's things in your inventory that are keys to unlock different doors throughout the dungeon, which is honestly really cool. So those are reasons that kept it up in B tier, but Spectacle dragged it down. For me personally, I don't like it. Now, that again, these are me personally. So if you like that aesthetic, this dungeon is going to be way higher up for you. But for me personally, I hate dungeons just being two colors the entire time. And by the way, that does not count the purple Axiom Bolts or the orange Fire. That does not count those. So yeah, there's that. Now that is the second worst dungeon for you, at least in my personal opinion. Now in 7th place, we have Spire of the Watcher, which is also in B tier. These are really, really close together. Also something to note, the reason why I did dock like maybe 8.22 from Pit of Heresy and Shattered Throne specifically, because they did not have a unique armor set before this current iteration. And also this armor set isn't exactly unique, it's just from seasons past. So yeah, just a little bit of a side note, because that's going to be brought up from Spire of the Watcher. Now Spire of the Watcher, it is in 7th place. It is in B tier still. Again, the only dungeon I really consider to be kind of bad is Pit of Heresy. Shattered Throne I consider to be in kind of just a sort of state. Spire of the Watcher is a little bit of the higher, like a little bit of a higher, you know, it's a little bit better than you know, so that's where I kind of identify that. Now, Spire of the Watcher, this fun fact here is, it is the only Vex dungeon in the entire game. Now, keep in mind, I did keep Equilibrium and, not Equilibrium, I kept in mind Vesper's Host has fallen, and Sunder Doctrine, which is Dread. So yeah, this is the only Vex dungeon in the entire game. Now, I know it does feel like Vex is featured quite a lot in Destiny 2 in terms of endgame activities. You're going to have to go see the raid video for that. But yes, Spire the Watcher is the only Vex dungeon in the entire game. But it did get an award as well. You got the award for Worst Loot. Worst Loot. Now, remember when I said I'm okay with armor set bonuses that are great in a niche? The armor set bonus isn't even great in the niche of being Tex Mechanica. Because, I mean, to be fair, we also don't necessarily have an exotic for Tex Mechanica weapons specifically. We have some that work with various ones, but there's no exotic for any Guardian class that has special interactions with Tex Mechanica stuff specifically. Which is kind of a shame. But, here's the problem. The rest of the weapons from Spire the Watcher are also ass, and have been ass for a long time. Even when Spire the Watcher came out, none of the weapons were meta. Like not even just meta, none of the weapons were really that good. The Arc LMG, even when they refreshed it for, or whatever. Then they refreshed it right before Edge of Fate. There is a craftable 7 Seraph revolver. There's another 7 Seraph craftable weapon from there. I believe it's an LMG or something from there as well. Also, the Void double fire grenade launcher. What are we actually doing? From what I remember, the best two are the Stasis sidearm and the Arc scout rifle. But being perfectly honest here, those are the only reasons why it's staying up a little bit. And of course, a hierarchy of needs is the main reason why it's just not in the absolute toilet of loot, because it doesn't have the worst loot. So yeah, in terms of hierarchy of needs was pretty good. It's pretty good now, but it's kind of struggled to find a good place to be. I think it's pretty good. I think it's pretty fun to use. It's pretty good. So, but all in all, Spire the Watcher has the worst of the entire game, and that's what mightily dragged it down. Now, in terms of difficulty, it is a little difficult. When you really know what you're doing, it's very fast and pretty easy. But the final boss can give you some trouble as well. So it's not like super duper easy, but it's pretty challenging until you really learn the dungeon as well. I do think the experience is very, very solid. So that is something to keep in mind here. I think running the dungeon is very fun. I think running Spire the Watcher is very fun. It's just the loot is the main reason that dragged it down. And in terms of spectacle, I think it's pretty good. It takes place on Mars. But unlike with, something like Shattered Throne, it goes into the different Warmind towers and that sort of thing. So it changes the aesthetic every so often. Like, a little bit swaps between two aesthetics, not just sticking to one color palette the entire time. So, that was quite fun. But yeah, the loot dragged it down. The extra stuff, I think, is pretty fine. I think it has a really good looking Solo Flawless emblem. And of course, cowboy hat. That cowboy hat was the main reason that, extra stuff, because I did consider the fashion aspect of things. And Spire the Watcher, we love the cowboy hat. So, but yeah, it's still going to remain in number 7. Okay, and now in number 6. So for number 6 onward, these are dungeons that I consider to be good. To be pretty good. These are dungeons that I consider to be pretty good. This is where we get into the A tier list of dungeons. And don't worry, I will do a recap of which dungeons are in what tier at the end. But Duality is going to be our number 6 dungeon. And it is an A tier. Now, your fun fact for this dungeon is it is the only dungeon this is the only raid or dungeon to have an exotic sword as the drop. Now, that is different from because again, even though you get Catalyst and other stuff from Equilibrium, you don't get the Praxis Blade from it. But Duality, no other raid or dungeon has an exotic sword that drops from it. So that is fun, kind of fun and pretty unique for this dungeon, considering how long it's been in the game. Because it's been in the game for a couple of years now, I believe. So, considering how long it's been in there, there's been 5 dungeons after this? No, I think it's closer to 7. It's been about 7 dungeons, about 3 more raids. So yeah, it's in a unique position. So that was my little fun fact for y'all. Now, Duality. Duality has our first positive award for Best Loot. It has Best Loot award. Now, as we talk about the loot here, again, this is where I'm kind of keeping in mind its history. Again, with Spire of the Watcher, the loot has never been good, and it is still not particularly great right now either. So, from my personal standpoint, these are talking about loot in perspectives of PvE, not PvP. Not PvP, just PvE strictly. And more so on the raid, dungeon, exotic missions, that sort of thing. But for Duality specifically, the armor set bonus is alright. I'm going to say this about all of the dungeon armor set bonuses, except Grasp of Avarice I think is pretty solid as well. So, but yeah. But the thing here is, Heart Shadow is good in its niche. In terms of in its niche, you are faster when you're invis. Now that almost every sword has Eager Edge on it, I think it should get Eager Edge. Or have its movement speed boost increased quite substantially while you're invisible. But it's a sword that applies Weaken as well. So I think it's at least for invis, for an invis hunter, for instance, I think it's pretty good. And I enjoy using it. So yeah. But outside of that, you have mainly two big boys and one little kind of used to be big. So when Duality released, the main three you wanted to get was Storm Chaser, which is the Arc linear fusion rifle, the Void SMG Unforgiven, and then there was a Stasis GL, because at the time, it was one of the few breach-loaded GLs that had blinding nades on them. It was also Stasis, so that was also kind of a new thing as well. So, keeping that stuff in mind, those two pretty good. Also, fixed odds, there were not too many solar LMGs that were even halfway decent at the time. Fixed odds was decent, so it kind of helped to try to fill that gap. Didn't do it super well, but nonetheless. However, now, Storm Chaser, still really good. Unforgiven is absolutely phenomenal. And of course, the Stasis GL is really good now as well. I think a decent amount of the loot in this dungeon is pretty worthwhile getting. And I do think, yes, best. Because I was all get into some of the other dungeons. I will say, this did tie one other dungeon, but it edged it out for particular reasons. So, yeah, that's all, pretty good. But overall, best loot, because as a collective piece, really good loot overall. Now, talking about some of the other stuff with this dungeon here, it's mid-tier in terms of difficulty. It's about in the middle of the road. It can give you some trouble sometimes. It's not super duper easy to learn, but it's also not a super hard dungeon either. So it's not enough of a challenge to really give an experienced team that much issue, especially now with our damage output. I do think Duality is a really good experience. I think you should. I think if you have not done the dungeon, you should, and definitely collect all the collectibles and whatnot. The lore is also pretty solid. In terms of spectacle, I think this is where it faltered just slightly. I think in terms of spectacle, it does falter a little bit. Because there is no sort of grand spectacle necessarily. The Nightmare Realm is cool. That's what I got points for. So I'm in between Normal Realm and Nightmare Realm is pretty cool. I was just really hoping to see more spectacle from, the dungeon being centered around Calus story-wise, but of course the final boss being Kylo herself. So in that respect, I'm a little disappointed. Now, in terms of extra stuff, it's alright. The collectibles carry it quite heavily in terms of the story and whatnot of the dungeon. And I do like the Heart Shadow quest. However, it can be annoying at times, and sometimes Heart Shadow quest is... Sometimes I'm not a huge fan of some of the stuff for the Catalyst, so... Yeah, it's kind of just middle of the road in terms of that for me personally. Also, I'm not a big fan of the Flawless Emblem or whatever, so... But yeah, that's going to be number 6 for y'all, the Big Boy Dungeon Duality. Now, in our number 5 spot, we are officially in the top 5. There is a particular old dungeon I've not mentioned yet, and that's what I'm going to mention. It's going to be Prophecy. Prophecy is going to be number 5 on our list here. It is an A tier. Now, the Prophecy fun fact, again, this one was quite difficult. for reasons I'll get into later. But Prophecy, your fun fact, it is the only raid or dungeon that has no exotic drop. It also has no exotic tie-in either. So that's interesting, because Witch Hunter is tied into Shadow Throne, Xenophage is tied into Pit of Heresy. You cannot obtain those if you don't have the access to the dungeon. So yeah, Prophecy is the only one that has no exotic tied to it whatsoever. If it had one, and if it was pretty decent, it would be higher up for sure. Now for Prophecy, it is an A tier. It is the only dungeon to not have any awards whatsoever. Mainly because a lot of things were balanced out. So here is where I'm going to go a little bit more into detail in terms of what I thought about each individual category that, I graded these dungeons on. So, for Prophecy specifically, for difficulty, I did give it a 4 out of 5, of course. I do think the dungeon is pretty difficult. This is mainly because of the second encounter. Not the first boss, but the actual second encounter, where the rooms, I think it can be quite tricky. And if one person accidentally dunks, it makes the encounter take so much longer. Also, I mean, the raid is relatively mechanically simple, but the way it uses the mechanics can be quite challenging at times. So that's the reason why I'm putting it. I gave it a pretty high difficulty rating. In terms of experience, I think this is a really, really good dungeon. Again, Duality and Prophecy, it was very, very difficult to separate these two, and there was only one category that separated it, and it wasn't experience. It was Spectacle. Prophecy is not my favorite dungeon in terms of Spectacle, but it is up there. It is up there. I would... again, Spectacle is really up to personal preference. But the Spectacle of Prophecy, visually, it is so good. So good. It is a beautiful looking dungeon. So, there's that. Now, its biggest issues were in loot and extras. Extras mainly. Because it has no exotic tie-in, it has no sort of catalyst quest tied to it at all. Also, the problem with Prophecy here is it does have an exotic ghost shell for Soul Floss or whatever, right? It has no real shader tied to it, as we'll get into later. It has no sort of real puzzle elements necessarily either. The secret chests are pretty in the way of different accounts. You don't have to go out of your way to unlock those or do anything either like that. So in terms of extras and secret stuff, just because you have story beats, that's the only reason why it doesn't get a super duper bad score. But, and same with the exotic ghost shell, but all in all, it just doesn't really have much to offer in terms of extra stuff other than just clearing the dungeon. In the loot specifically, it did used to have 2 armor sets. The weapons used to not be that great. They're still not that great. So it struggles in that department either. However, I'm not going to go out of my way to say that the loot is actively bad. That's what I'm not saying. But the loot is kind of just all right. It's good if you're kind of starting out or whatever. So, and the armor set bonus is pretty decent. So that's what I have to say about Prophecy. But Prophecy, all in all, I do like the dungeon. It's honestly a pretty fun experience and a pretty good fun time. So on that note, though, that is going to be your number 5. Well, my number 5 place being Prophecy. And up next, we're going to have our last A-tier dungeon. Now, in our number 4 spot, we have Ghosts of the Deep. Now, for Ghosts of the Deep, it's fun fact for you, it is the only raid or dungeon to have Hive Guardian bosses. It is the only one. There are no other dungeons that have Hive Guardians at all in them, and for, well, at least to my knowledge. Again, Sunder Doctrine might be the one that might have one, but to my knowledge, it doesn't have it. It doesn't have one. Also, I couldn't remember quite correctly if Vow of the Disciple has it at the beginning. That's why I'm saying Raid or Dungeon that has it as a boss. Because Vow of the Disciple, to my recollection, does have a Hive Wizard at the start. And also, do you count Savathûn as a Hive Guardian? Yes? So, you see what I mean? You get into some weird territory, right? But yes, it does. It is the only raid or dungeon to have Hive Guardian bosses. This is partially due to D2 having a massive lack of Hive raids specific to D2. So, but that'll be saved for raid video. Now, for this, for Ghost of the Deep specifically. It did get one award. That being Best Spectacle. Now, because I love the Hive aesthetic. I love the Hive aesthetic. I love Titan as a planet. Fusing those two together was peak. You go into underwater. The underwater sections look so cool. Seeing the sunken Dreadnought was so cool. So fighting on Oryx's dead body was so sick. It's just so sick. Keep in mind, this was a three-way tie between Ghost of the Deep and our number 1 and number 2 spots. So just keep that in mind. But just overall, there was just little things here and there that just edged it out barely. Absolutely love this dungeon in terms of a spectacle perspective. Now, in terms of the rest, difficulty. This was tied for the hardest dungeon. Large in part due to final boss in Ekthar. Specifically because of those two encounters. This dungeon is kind of long. And of course, with long dungeons comes with some difficulties. For example, if not a single person knows how Ekthar works, you can be in Ekthar for a very, very, very long time. I think it's like an infinite amount of time, or until the game crashes, and y'all will just be clearing and just doing fuck all. Ekthar's not super difficult himself. This is mainly going to be, this is more of a memory thing. Because I do think Oryx is quite a difficult encounter, because there's a lot of stuff to dodge, even from a mechanic perspective. You have to make sure you look at the correct symbol, you look at the symbol, then crush the ghost before it disappears. You have to remember the hive symbols, and if you're in a team, you gotta know, the calls and whatnot. So, that is something of note. Not super easy dungeon to survive either, so there's a difficulty. It didn't win the award for my hardest dungeon, but it is up there. And then for for experience, I think the experience of the dungeon is pretty good. It did get docked points for parkouring specifically. I do think in terms of first runs, Ghost of the Deep is one of the best dungeons in the entire game. I know I'm saying that despite it being number 4, but its issue is on repeat playthroughs, going through the underwater sections are really slow. And it takes quite a bit of time to get from encounter to encounter, so it did get docked some points for that. Now, in terms of loot, it's pretty decent. The Cold Comfort is still one of the only stasis rocket launchers that can get Cluster Bomb on it. The Solar SMG was, back in the day, the only solar weapon to get Demolitionist Incandescent. However, there is a better role for a Solar SMG now. That is Attrition Orbs and Burning Ambition, and that is found on the Solstice of Heroes SMG, the Solar SMG. Peak. If y'all have not tried that SMG, y'all should try it. But those weapons are pretty good. Now, the main thing that's carrying it in terms of loot is Navigator. Navigator. The best oobing exotic that we've ever gotten, including over Salvation's Grip. Now, those of y'all that are not familiar with the oobing space, Salvation's Grip, when it came out, was extremely good because you could get through locked areas, and that was how, you could get through Last Wish doors with cheese. This also led to a bunch of Deepstone Crypt cheeses, so that's something of note. But Navigator really opened things up. It really opened up grapple melee strategies for damage. It opened up getting across long distances. You put a grapple point in the air, grapple. It did help me personally complete the Featherlight Triumph. This is just an absolutely phenomenal trace rifle for just utility. Probably, in my personal opinion, the best utility exotic in Destiny 2's history since I've been playing the game, since Season of Arrivals, is Navigator. I'll put that even over Eager Edge as a perk. Navigator. So huge. Because there were certain areas you could get to with just Eager Edging. But Navigator was fucking huge. So that's the main reason why it's pretty high. However, issues. The rest of the loot in Ghost of the Deep is terrible. The Glaive. Who has ever talked about the Ghost of the Deep Glaive? I bet you even forgot the Glaive existed. It did have a Stasis Waveframe GL. I believe it was Waveframe. Don't quote me on that. But it's kind of eh. Also, the Arbor Set bonus, at least in my opinion, I know some people like it, but I personally hate it because it can't necessarily be proc solo that easily. if at all. And for me personally, in order for an armor set bonus to be good, the 2 and the 4 set have to be good, not just the 2 or just the 4. So yeah, for those reasons, and I play solo a lot, so yeah, I can't make use out of it, generally speaking. So that's the things that knocked it down. But all the loot from the rest of the dungeon is really good. But yeah, that was a complicated situation. I had to talk about the loot and the extra stuff. Love the armor set look. Love Ghost of the Deep armor set. In terms of full armor set, my favorite dungeon armor set. In terms of just all of its look, favorite armor set in the entire game. Also, getting the Navigator quest I think is pretty cool. Also, the emblems are fucking sick. So, yeah. So that is going to be number 4. And of course, as we go a little bit higher and higher here, we are going to have more things to discuss in terms of the top 3 dungeons. Now, in our number 3 spot, we have Warlord's Ruin, number 3 dungeon. This is the first dungeon in S tier. These next 3 dungeons are in S tier. These scores are so close together, like, I'm not joking here. I decided to only have the top 3 dungeons being in S tier, and the top 3 raids will be in S tier as well. So, number 3 is Warlord's Ruin. Now, Warlord's Ruin, the fun fact for you. It has the first primary / special ammo hybrid. And by the way, that is in general. I'm mainly talking about primary ammo weapons that get turned into either rocket or, something like, for example, rocket sidearms, rocket pulse rifles, and the special ammo auto rifle as well. It was the first one to do that, and same with the reverse being primary ammo trace rifle. So it was the first to do that. Because the Elithinum, the primary ammo stasis GL, came out, to my recollection, it came out after, I believe it came out at the same time as Warlord's Ruin. As if I remember correctly. No, it didn't. It came out before, because Warlord's Elithinum came out with episode Revenant, if I remember correctly. So, yeah. Warlord's Ruin was the first to have any of that. It was the first. Because you got your Arc Rocket Sidearm, and of course, Bear Bloodline as the exotic. Now, of course, as I said, this dungeon is in S tier. Now, Warlord's Ruin got one award. And that award is being the hardest dungeon in the game. For me personally. Because low-key, there are quite a lot of things that, during the encounters, that can kind of feel like you're throwing. For example, first encounter, the cages. If you can't find the eyes, you perish. It's not super duper easy to find all the eyes to take them out. And by the way, I have soloed this dungeon. Not flawless, I did the Dark Age Hunt Triumph. That's what I think is the most difficult. I have soloed 4 dungeons. Those dungeons are Duality, Spire of the Watcher, Grasp of Avarice, and Warlord's Ruin. I solo flawless Spire of the Watcher and Grasp of Avarice. But Warlord's Ruin still considered to be super difficult, mainly because of the second encounter, mainly because of both boss encounters. That other boss encounter, if you get caught jumping near any sort of ledge, if the ogre is aggroing on you, you're cooked. You're cooked. Also, and it's very easy to lose track of buffs and whatnot, but yeah, I think it's the hardest dungeon. Not going to go too much into detail here. Now, in terms of experience, I think it is one of the best dungeons in the entire game in terms of experience. It was a 3-way tie, by the way, in terms of best experience, so I had to pick one. But in terms of experience, it is a really, really fun dungeon to run. So that's what I guess. The spectacle is pretty good as well. I do like the music from this dungeon. I think it's pretty solid. Again, I'm not mentioning music unless I think it's better than mid, and it is better than mid in my opinion. Now, in terms of the loot of the dungeon, it is pretty heavily carried by the Arc Rocket Sidearm. However, that has not really been meta in quite some time for arc weapons, large in part, like for the most part. Buried Bloodlight is still a fantastic exotic. Indebted Kindness is still pretty good, which is the Rocket Arc Sidearm. Now, keep in mind, the Strand Bow I think is pretty decent. However, I prefer the one from Festival of the Lost, being Hushed. No, I forget what it's called, but there's one from Festival of the Lost, the Halloween event, that I personally like a little bit more. The rest of the weapons are kind of just there. They're kind of just there. The armor set bonus is pretty decent as well, so it's still got high marks for that. Now, in terms of extras, it actually does kind of have quite a bit of extra stuff to it. Now, I did not consider the Dark Age Hunt stuff for that because it was a limited time thing, so I did not consider that. The Rose Ruin emblems are they're pretty decent. Not my absolute favorite, but I don't think they're the worst either. Also, in terms of secret shenanigans, there is a quest for there are going to be special screams along the way, and you can upgrade your quest to essentially unlock newer and newer doors that will lead to seeing an Ahamkara bones and whatnot, and you get some lines about shacks. That's pretty cool. I like all that stuff. You would think that I would have given it the best marks for that. However, my biggest issue with that is it is a quest. It is not something that you come across in the dungeon naturally or have to look up a guide to do. Because it's a quest, I docked a few points off for that. But yeah, Warlord's Ruin, I think it's a really good dungeon. It is not top 2 though, but it is top 3. Speaking of top 2, let's go ahead and get into our number 2 spot. Now, before I get into number 2 here, just because it's my favorite dungeon doesn't mean I believe it to be the overall best. So that I did separate the two for this as well. That is the same case with the raids as well. The best raid, in my opinion, is not my absolute favorite. Like my absolute, well, the better way to word it is, my favorite raid is not the best raid in my opinion, and my favorite dungeon, I don't think it's the best dungeon. So, on that note though, let's go ahead and get into our number 2 spot. Okay, in our number 2 spot, we have Grasp of Avarice. Grasp of Avarice is my personal favorite dungeon. I don't think it is the best dungeon in the game. So, Grasp of Avarice. Your fun fact for Grasp of Avarice. It is the first raid and dungeon since Spire of Stars to have an obtainable exotic ornament for the given activity's exotic weapon. So for instance, by the way, this is technically the only one in the entire game that exists. The reason why I worded it like this is because technically speaking, Equilibrium does have an exotic ornament attached to it. However, its exotic ornament is not for the exotic that drops from Equilibrium. It's for the lightsaber. However, Grasp of Avarice is the only one in the entire game where its exotic drop has an obtainable exotic ornament from the same activity. And the reason why I mentioned Spire of Stars here is because Spire of Stars had Legend of Acrius's or exotic ornament. That's still unobtainable and will never be unobtainable in this game for some reason. They didn't bring it back for some reason. I was really hoping they would. But the reason why I am pointing this out here is Spire of Stars was a raid layer of the Leviathan. You have to kind of consider, how do you consider the raid layers in relation to their raids, because Legend of Acrius dropped from actual Leviathan and it didn't drop from Spire of Stars, but raid layer, you know what I mean? So weird situation. But Grasp of Avarice had the Gjallarhorn ornament, which is honestly a really cool ornament from collecting all the collectibles. So there's that. And of course, we know the dungeons in S tier, being Mr. Number 2. Now, this actually got a bad award, but it did get 2 good awards as well. For the bad one, it has the easiest dungeon in the entire game, which I still hold to. I think it is easier than Pit of Heresy, and I think it is easier than Shadow Throne as well. It is the easiest dungeon in the game. Yeah, it just is. I do wish it was a little bit more difficult. The hardest challenge is probably the Sparrow section in terms of flawless, but after that other encounter where you have to send servitors over it, that's probably the most challenging part. But it's not challenging because of the mechanics, it's challenging because the big ball servitor, it can be kind of finicky to try to move sometimes. I wish you could just pick it up and drop it, but we can't do that here. So Grasp of Avarice got easiest dungeon, and that is a negative. But keep in mind, I did weight these in a way to where difficulty didn't have a massive impact on the overall score, because just because a raid or dungeon is the hardest doesn't mean it's the best, and just because it is the easiest doesn't mean it's the worst. However, it did get 2 awards for Best Music and Best Experience. which I know my favorite activity is gonna of course go win that best experience. First off, music, iconic, iconic, best music, best dungeon music, best dungeon music right there in Grasp of Avarice. I will say the problem with a lot of the dungeon music specifically, music was very mid for almost all of the dungeons outside of a couple, or their dungeon music was way too similar to their regular campaign music. Looking at you, Equilibrium. But for raids, a lot of the raid music is more unique, so it was a little bit easier to discern the raid music that I liked, the raid music that was mid, and did I really not like any of the raid, like some of the raid music for like raids and whatnot. So for dungeons, it was a lot harder because it was just very mid all over the place. But Grasp of Avarice, really iconic. I love the dungeon music; it's so good. Makes me bop my head every time I'm playing the dungeon. In terms of experience, my favorite one because I love taking new players through it, and for like a sharp, I love sharpering, especially back in the day, I loved sharpering. You take them to the trap, bam, they fall for the trap's hook, line, and sinker. I love it. I love going through the section. I love the Sparrow section as well. It really breaks it up between just you having to do entrance shenanigans, traversal, boss, traversal, encounter, traversal, boss, or like short traversal or whatever have you. It breaks up the monotony of having to do that for like the past 3 dungeons by the time that released. So having the Sparrow section was pretty good, and Sparrow section would not come back again until Equilibrium. So quite massive gaps between Sparrow sections. I thought this one, Grasp of Avarice, was really fun as well. I wished it was a little bit less on terms of the final section, but yeah, in terms of getting to some of the other stuff, it did not win awards for it, but still got high marks for. Spectacle, sparrowing into either the mouth or the eye of the skull is so cool. Just I like a lot of the dungeon's aesthetic, even though yes, it's Cosmodrome themed or whatever, like it's in the Cosmodrome, but I really like this dungeon from a spectacle perspective. It's just really fun. Also, I did count this for this, but Frieza, the first ogre boss, has a chance to drop down from the ceiling in a very similar fashion to the cleric beast in Bloodborne. Love that detail. I don't know if it was intentional or not, but I absolutely love that. Also, as you're filling up the crystal, it does get bigger, which I think is a very cool, unique little detail. So for those, peak. And then for loot, the loot is mainly being carried by Gjallarhorn. The loot from Grasp of Avarice in the past was not good at all. However, now it's pretty decent. I will say, even when Grasp of Avarice came out, the main weapon you kind of wanted from a PvE perspective was Hero of Ages, because it was an Arc Vortex frame, and that did not really exist prior to that. Outside of, I think Deepstone, I think Bequest is a Vortex frame sword, but especially with a sword with chain reaction on it was very rare at the time. So that's the main reason why you wanted that sword. However, Gjallarhorn, still to this day, one of the best ad clear exotics in terms of like solar and everything. It also buffs other rocket launchers. The thing was meta when it returned for quite some time, until Rocket DPS fell out of fashion. And Rocket DPS is not really much of a thing anymore. So, outside of Truth. And Gjallarhorn doesn't buff exotic rockets, so there's that. But all in all, Gjallarhorn, really solid. That's the main reason why it got high marks for the loot specifically. Also, the armor set bonus from Grasp of Avarice is actually really good. So, go ahead and check it out. But again, it's too generalized for me to really go out of my way to use it. And in terms of extras, it did get high marks for that, because the Flawless Shader is really good. I like the dungeon armor aesthetically. At least I like parts of it. Again, Ghost of the Deep is my favorite armor set visually from a top to bottom. Grasp of Avarice has my favorite legs, so it has really good individual pieces. And of course, the Warlock robes from Grasp of Avarice, so good. The exotic ornament for Gjallarhorn that is tied to it is really good. The story of Grasp of Avarice's dungeon is really good as well. It got me kind of invested in looking at the lore tabs and whatnot. It's just really cool. Reverencing the Loot Cave is so fun as well. The extra stuff is really good. Also, best solo flawless emblem. Hands down. So yeah, there's all of that extra stuff for Goddess of Avarice. I really do love this dungeon. It is my personal favorite. However, I don't believe it is the best dungeon. So that is something of note. However, it was the only dungeon that won multiple awards that were good. So that's, I will say that is, of course, but my favorite activity is going to do that. My favorite activity is going to do that, of course. Now, it is going to be time to go into what I believe to be the best dungeon in the entire game as a whole. Okay, and on our number 1 spot, we have Equilibrium. We have Equilibrium. I do believe it is the best dungeon in the entire game. Now, your fun fact for Equilibrium, it is the only Raiden dungeon to have Catalyst for an exotic that is not the exotic that drops from the Raiden dungeon. And of course, this dungeon is an S tier, of course. Now, why I'm saying this is because it has Catalyst for the lightsaber specifically. No other raid or dungeon has Catalyst for a different one. For like Divinities doesn't have, like Garden of Salvation doesn't have a Catalyst for Witherhoard. Right? So that's what I'm more so meaning. Now, I will say Deepstone Crypt might be an exception. I don't have confirmation that Lament actually drops from Deepstone Crypt. From what I have heard, people have mainly gotten Lament's Catalyst from exotic orders. So that is the part that makes me a little confused. So, outside of that might be an exception. I don't think it drops from Deepstone Crypt, but again, don't know for sure. But Equilibrium specifically, it drops the lightsaber Catalyst, despite the crossbow heirloom is actually the exotic for this dungeon, which I have not gotten the drop, so I don't have it. But so there is that. Now, it did get 1 award. It got 1. And that award was extras. Best extras from a dungeon. Mainly because of a few things. Again, I cannot speak for Vesper Sosa's Thunder Doctrine, but it has a way to focus for specific dungeon loot, which no dungeon, at least Warlord's Ruin and prior, you could not focus for a particular dungeon loot. You couldn't. But with Equilibrium, you can. That is after you have after you have unlocked some stuff and done some of the lightsaber stuff in the Equilibrium dungeon, which was pretty cool. Also, it has a Taken Crystal, which is absolutely phenomenal as well. So, all of that jazz. Now, outside of the extra stuff, also the dungeon armor looks pretty good as well. It looks pretty good as well. Now, in terms of difficulty, I did think this dungeon was pretty difficult. I did not believe it to be as hard as Ghost of the Deep or Warlord's Ruin, because especially it's pretty simplistic when you understand the mechanics. The encounter that's going to give most people the biggest issue is the final boss, but it's not that bad to know Mike for the most part. So, Equilibrium, not the hardest dungeon, but still pretty difficult. It did get multiple ties. It was tied in experience and spectacle, of course. Now, you might not believe Goddess of Avarice has a better experience, but Equilibrium as an experience is really, really good as well. In my personal opinion, it is best when everybody has a mic, but, you know, it's not that bad of an experience when nobody has mics either. But I think it's a really, really good experience. One of the best experiences in Destiny 2. Of course, I'm saying it's the best dungeon. It has to have the best experience. Well, at least one of the best experiences. In terms of spectacle, I prefer Ghost of the Deep in terms of actual spectacle, but it is still there. It is still up there. Especially from someone that loves Star Wars, and, you know, loves Star Wars. Not the new stuff, of course. Like Star Wars, the Clone Wars, the OG Lego games, of course. I even like their prequels, except for Attack of the Clones. That's the only one I didn't really care for. But I love the Star Wars aesthetics and whatnot. So for me, again, might not be your top dungeon. But for me, this is my top dungeon. Because I love that aesthetic. And also jumping from ship to ship is cool. You starting on the surface of Venus and then transporting up to space, I think was pretty cool. They could have shown a little bit more of that, but I love the spectacle. It's this dungeon. And the boss whipping out lightsabers, the first boss and the second boss basically being a Palpatine reference. So cool. So cool. So yeah, spectacle is high up there for me. And again, I did give the music a 4, large in part out of 5, large in part due to it is too similar. It got a point being docked because it's too similar to campaign music. So that's why I didn't win Best Music. Now, in terms of loot. Loot is where things got a little problematic. The crossbow bolt is good. Crossbow bolt, sorry, not crossbow bolt. The heirloom crossbow is pretty good. Is pretty good. However, the best weapon from this dungeon is the LMG, Bitter End. That was the best LMG in the game, in my personal opinion. Absolutely phenomenal. Love it. However, the weapon of choices are kind of weird. I find the choice to have a Void Sword that's heat related, I find that to be a little bit strange. Also, the sniper is kind of eh. The rest of the weapons are kind of just eh as a whole outside of the LMG. The armor set bonus, I'm not the biggest fan of as well. So those are just some things to note as well. But again, it did get really positive marks for Bitter End specifically. And I did think the Solar Auto Rifle was decent. However, it has a good perk combo, but I don't know. It doesn't hit as hard as I would have liked it to. So yeah, those are your dungeons ranked. So just to give a quick recap, in order from last to first, we had Pit of Heresy, Shattered Throne, Spire of the Watcher, Duality, Prophecy, Ghosts of the Deep, Warlord's Ruin, Grasp of Avarice, and Equilibrium. And in terms of the tiers, in C tier had Pit of Heresy. In B tier we had Shattered Throne and Spire of the Watcher. In A tier we had Duality, Prophecy, and Ghosts of the Deep. And then in S tier were Warlord's Ruin, Grasp of Avarice, and Equilibrium. But on that note though, I appreciate y'all for tuning in. Let me know where y'all would put Vespers, Host, and Center Doctrine if you have played them, and I've played them a decent amount. Let me know. Is at least your top dungeon? Is at least one of my top 3 dungeons in your top 3? Might as well just let me know your top 3 dungeons. If you have been playing for the game since Destiny 2 started, Shattered Throne is probably going to be very, very high up there for you. But I'm considering these dungeons also in their current state as well as how they've been in the majority of their life cycle. So on that note though, I do appreciate y'all for tuning in. Do expect a raid video to hit later, but I have been struggling, at least while I'm recording this, I've been mightily struggling to get Salvations, to even get a Salvation's Edge run in. So I think I'm going to just have to wait until it becomes, some other things. But anyways, that note though, thanks for tuning in, and I'm going to catch y'all on the flip side.